Good evening, friends, and welcome to another episode of Tim Kirby Russia. Today with us, our guest is Pavel Krasnov, a Czech-Russian journalist and political analyst who writes for various outlets such as Press Latina, he's also a former aide in the Czech Parliament, and he's here to talk about all things Trump. And why? Because I was talking to Pavel recently, and he sort of expressed the opinion that Trump is exactly the same as all the other presidents before him, and he had a lot of good reasons why, and I want him to come on the show as sort of a counterpoint, because many of you have noticed I'm kind of a fan of the Orange Man, so this will be interesting. But first, Pavel, you recently wrote an article called Normalizing Relations with a Pathological Liar. That's about U.S.-Russian relations. Could you explain to us a bit about this? What was the thesis of this article? What were you trying to say? Who's the pathological liar? Would Trump lie?
Right. Yeah, of course. Good evening, everyone. Tim, thanks for having me. So the article, the main thesis, the overarching thesis, is that so we keep going through these various, what I called it in the article, cycles of American aggression against Russia. So, and I brought the example of Georgia before, where if you look at the situation, what happened there, the playbook isn't just similar, it is identical to what happened in Ukraine. And Brian Beletic, one of my favorite political commentators, talks about this a lot, that the playbook in all of these countries, in the Pacific, in Ukraine, in Georgia, it's all the same. Mm-hmm. And so what I said in that article is, so after that example, after the previous cycle of aggression in Georgia failed, and Georgia, well, really lost territories, and the country went through this difficult period, and there was a war, there was a civil war and a war. The administration that came after George W. Bush suddenly wanted to normalize relations with Russia. And so you had the then Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, making these sort of friendly, but also kind of passive-aggressive comments towards Russia. And, you know, there's really no reason to be antagonistic. So suddenly, the reason for the hostilities was no longer there. And so that all ended, and then we got a new administration. Now, you said you're a fan of an Orange Man. I myself am somewhat of a fan of the Orange Man.
Oh, that's surprising from our last conversation. But anyways, okay, let's go. We'll carry on.
So people often forget that the current cycle of aggression against Russia started with Donald Trump. He was the one who lifted the embargo on the delivery of lethal aid to Ukraine. It was him, javelins, famously. So then, of course, infamously, Joe Biden finished the job. And I ask myself and the readers in that article, I do like my analogies. So let me start with an analogy. Let's imagine you're in a bad relationship. We've all been there. And you have a terrible fight. And then the next day you make up. Oh, no, I love you. No, it's actually really good. And then the next day you have another fight. And then you make up again. And then you have another fight. And a month goes by. A year goes by. Well, hopefully by that time you both realize
basically nothing changes. You fight over the same thing, and neither side is willing to make any sort of radical change because maybe it's their nature to be a certain way.
Yeah, that's actually very well put. So at what point in a relationship like this does one person or both go, right, maybe normalizing our relations or making up in that case, maybe it's meaningless because this is the normal, because we are just, well, in that analogies are only going to go so far, but in that case, maybe we're not compatible. Maybe we're not just meant for each other, whatever people call that. So at what point do you go, right, maybe it's not really worth normalizing anymore, and we should just go our separate ways. And in that article, I'll come back to Russia and the United States relationship itself. At what point, and this is maybe, I don't hold delusion of grandeur. I doubt anyone. I doubt Lavrov is watching, and I'm sure all these people realize it themselves. But I would ask, at what point does Russia sit down and realize maybe this is the normal? So maybe we should just forget about normalizing relations and live in the reality of the world, which is, well, this is what it is, and this is what we need to work with, instead of thinking about fantastic alternatives that just aren't possible for one way or another. It doesn't really matter why.
Well, Pavel, I just wanted to say you've kind of blown my mind here, man. I kind of wanted to have someone on this week to be a bit of a counterpoint, but I super mega ultra agree with you. And I think one thing that people who've followed my work or media appearances within Russia over, the last, I've been in Russia for 20 years, but I think I've worked in the media for more like 15 years. And that's one of the main things I've kind of been an advocate against is this like obsessive love of the West. It doesn't work. The West will never ever, and I'm talking more about like the elite sense, will never ever ever accept Russia. It'll never happen. You'll never be part of the West. You
No.
will always be outsiders. But anyways, please carry on, please.
Yeah, when talking about always being the outsiders, this go back. I've had this conversation once on one of my previous conferences or streams or whatever it was, with a Russian political scientist, and we spoke about the Great Schism in Christianity in the 11th century, and I said to him that this idea of Russians being something else, it really can be traced all the way back there, because that schism really did something. So we used to be Christians. We all used to be one civilization. Let's call it that. Alexander Dugin, for example, likes to use these terms. I personally don't, but let's just do it for the sake of this conversation. So the split between the two civilizations goes all the way back then. And from that moment, Russians were something else. They were the others, right? So, as you said, all these attempts to come closer to the West and be friends with the West, I agree with you completely that will never work, because they don't consider us to be one of them. This can never work. So there is an idea during the Cold War. There was this idea of the first world, that being the West, right? So that's the United States and their allies. Then there being the second world, which was the Soviet Union and their allies. And then the term the third world, that's where it comes from. The term third world were the states, the countries that don't belong to either. So, but now that the Soviet Union no longer exists, it really was kind of all thrown into the same bag. So you're either...
And yet that expression carries on to this day, and we use it all the time. It's just the whole second world part is very rarely stated, but the idea of the third world existing, that's standard.
Yeah, and well, that changed. So because the term second world is no longer in use, because it doesn't exist anymore, but the term third world changed its meaning and today means vaguely savages, right? So
pretty much. In fact, you just mentioned Dugin. I believe Dugin would say that throughout history, especially the West has viewed the world as civilized barbarians and savages. And so Russians and Chinese just the Chinese are still kind of communist. That's an open question. But essentially, the second world are just the barbarians. And it doesn't really matter what system they have. But anyways.
We don't talk to barbarians, right? Because they're barbarians.
Yeah, there's no
point. We are Rome. We are the civilized folk. And they are barbarians. We don't talk to them. They do what we tell them. So this mentality is highly prevalent in the West with statesmen and political, let's call it, people. Let's just say that. it's all over the place. So how can we possibly have a relationship, let alone a positive one, with people who see us as savages? That's just not. I mean, the expression post Cold War expression or post Soviet Union expression about Russia that I'm sure you've heard, a petrol station masquerading as a country. This is
Yeah, yeah.
how they see Russia. How can we possibly have a positive relationship? It's absurd. So when you say it needs to stop, and I've only mentioned the historical context because it really goes a long way back. I mean, famously, Peter the First wanted to be more like the West. And then during the monarchy, it kind of went back and forth because different monarchs had different priorities.
No.
But yeah, absolutely, I 100% agree with you. But don't worry, we'll find points to
Oh,
disagree
okay.
to
Good,
disagree.
good. Well, that always makes the program more interesting. But yeah, well the thing is about what you said about how can we get along? Well, one thing that I've tried to express to Russians, which is kind of hard to get at, is that they, especially people in the leadership, I kind of asked them like, how would like a slave on the plantation get the attention of their master, like a freed slave, and be like, look, we're equal now. Like the one of the main problems is that the Russians refuse to understand the dynamic when they did work with the West of being despised. I think because in Russia people don't really obviously all human beings feel hatred, but Russians tend to not really be super hate filled. So I think they don't quite understand that like true Western like hatred that you can have, which is more, or at least for me, because I was born there. It's a lot easier to just hate something than for Russian people. Russian people tend to just sort of, I don't know, whatever, let it go through the breeze, or I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain, but essentially, they can't seem to understand the idea of like you have to go into some sort of discussion, understanding that you are seen as, we'll be polite, the N word, or like a Jew in Nazi Germany, or whatever. You are this Untermensch,
Less
in their
than, yeah.
opinion.
You mentioned that you keep trying to explain this to Russians. I think
Yeah.
after the beginning of the special military operation, a lot of this changed, especially with young people,
Yeah.
to a large degree. I don't know whether or not you'll agree with me, but as far as I can tell, um, a large portion of the population started thinking in terms of, right, maybe we don't need to be subservient,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe we don't need to be like them. Maybe we can be our own thing. And modern Russia still, to this day, has somewhat of an identity crisis. So you had the Russian Empire, which was one entity, and then you had the Soviet Union, which was another entity. And today you have this modern Russia, which still, to some extent, and as I said, in the past
Mm-hmm.
3 years, that is changing somewhat. But it still has that identity crisis where it doesn't really know what it wants to be. Do we
Mm-hmm.
want to be this great power, uh, or do we want to maybe be a bit more timid, or who are we? And the identity crisis, of course, comes from the fact that the Russian Empire fell apart. Well, fell apart, largely sold off. But so yeah, so there is this identity crisis in Russia. And when, I don't know whether or not you tell the people that you talk to, but we've already had the situation in the modern times, in contemporary memory, that where we were friends with the
Mm-hmm.
West. That was the 90s.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
already had that situation. Now, anyone who remembers the 90s also remembers what that looked like
Well, yeah,
and
it's
what
sort of
an
like I believe it's like author Nikolai Starikov says, like, what are the terms of friendship with America? Well, it's the
yeah,
'90s.
destitution. Yeah, exactly. It is complete destitution where people aren't getting paid for months.
Yeah.
Social services don't work. It was a tragedy for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what friendship with the United States looks like. A famous American political scientist said it quite openly. He said, "Being our enemy is dangerous. Being our friends is lethal."
Oh, you
I
mean
don't remember was
Henry
that Henry
Kissinger?
Kissinger?
Kissinger, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think so. So he said it quite openly. So when people
Yeah.
talk about friendship with the US, I don't really understand what they're talking about. Is that something you really want? Because that's the reality. Now, we can always go back to dreaming, we can
Yeah.
always talk about, well, wouldn't it be great if we were friends but on equal terms? Maybe that would be great, maybe not. We don't have alternative universes where we can see how that would look like. In the real world, in our sometimes very horrible world, this is the reality. So it and I'm glad one of the things that happened, as I said already, in the past 3 years, is that people are slowly, but to a large extent, starting to realize this.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that's one of those weird cultural things. I've heard even that with discussions with certain East Asian countries, like your sort of triangle of China, the Koreas, and Japan. One thing that's sort of difficult with dealing with them is that it's for them natural to never really say anything that honest or critical. So, for example, the person said that, say you speak Chinese terribly and you speak Chinese, they'll say, "Oh, your Chinese is so good." Say you speak Chinese phenomenally, they'll say exactly the same. "Oh, your Chinese is so good." Because that's like the polite thing to say. You have really no idea what they're actually sort of thinking. And that's one of the other sort of difficult dynamics with working with their culture. So with the West, the dynamic is, how do you deal with this person who thinks you're inferior? With East Asians, it's sort of, how do you deal with someone who answers politically correctly to maybe not hurt your feelings all the time, true or not true. So yeah, it's difficult dealing with people. In fact, Pavel, on a personal note, the hardest thing in my life is actually dealing with people. Dealing with anything that's non-human is easy. Like wood, metal, and bricks and all that, they don't fight back. They don't talk back. It's humans that are the real difficult thing. But anyways, Pavel, one thing I wanted to have you on the program for was to talk about how Trump is exactly the same as his predecessors. We're doing this interview right after Trump did his tariff mania, his big tariff mania. He's released all the documents about USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy. I think that those are some things that are definitely pretty original. But what are some things that Trump has done that are literally like Biden 2.0? Well, then again, Biden is kind of like Obama 2.0. So Obama 3.0. How is Trump Obama the third?
Roosevelt 15.0.
Whoa, we're going way back here. Okay, all right.
Um, right. So when it comes to Trump, when you and I spoke about this briefly the other day,
Yeah.
I mentioned tariffs. I'll come to tariffs. I made a note here. I'll come back to
Mm-hmm.
tariffs. But what I mentioned to you is, again, I love my analogies. I brought to you the analogy of a train that
Mm-hmm.
is on its way to a destination, right? Just any destination. It doesn't really matter at this point. And some of its path, every time the United States changes its administration, and this is also a big question that I don't really want to discuss that yet at this point in my life, because I can't say I am sure or even be close to sure. But how much power does the U.S. president really have, and to what
Yeah.
extent is he actually elected? All that. Let's not go there. Let's not
Mm-hmm.
let's not touch on that. But so every time the administration changes, certain parts of the train are diverted to one side or another. And
Mm-hmm.
for example, with Donald Trump, you mentioned the example of, what would we call it to stay polite? Is trying to normalize relations towards homosexuality and all that LGBT stuff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So he's trying to step on a break when it comes to the lunacy part of it, right? So you brought that example. So
Mm-hmm.
that's one part of the thing. So well, I'll come back to that actually
Yeah.
to
Well, one
say
thing that I would
how
even
that.
argue against my sort of like myself in a way is Russians often ask me about like Trump and his sort of anti-LGBT thing, and I remind them that, remember, this is Trump like saying you can't do this in the context of the army, or you can't get financed via gigantic grants from USAID for this kind of stuff. He is never, ever, ever going to, in some way, try to like ban it or criminalize it in some sort of like personal social way, because no matter what, all American politicians are liberal in one way or another. Because yeah, It's not going to be like in Russia where they're just like, you're born the gender you're born, deal with it. He is not going to do that.
Right. So I'll come back to the LGBT stuff in a minute. But so what I wanted to say, so stuff like this minor in the grand scheme of things, right? Those minor parts of the train keep diverting every time the United States changes its administration, but the train itself keeps going in the same direction. And this is where I said in the grand scheme of things, this is where the grand scheme of things come into picture. This is, for example, United States foreign policy, which hasn't changed I'm not that old, but I don't remember it ever being different. And if we go back to the building of the Panama Canal, the playbook was the same. So back then Colombia refused to give the United States the rights to build that canal.
Yeah.
And the United States just couped the government and just took it anyway.
They found a way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. They found a way, such as it was. So when it comes to this approach, we can go back all the way, and the playbook hasn't changed. And so the train keeps going in the same direction. And when we spoke, again, you and I, when we spoke the other day about it, I brought the example of, so the tariffs, I'll come to tariffs now then. The tariffs that Trump is talking about currently, and he imposed supposedly, let's say supposedly for the time being, it only happened a few days ago. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, let's see if they actually get implemented, but yes.
Yeah, exactly. So Trump talks a lot, doesn't he? And he makes all these grandiose statements, these big statements about we'll take Greenland and we will leave NATO and we'll leave UN and we'll do all this tariff stuff. The thing is, he did the same thing in 2016.
Yeah.
He made the same statements about the same things. In the United States, so the idea that the United States will leave NATO, people listen to him because Donald Trump has managed to build I don't want to call it cult of personality, let's call it fandom. Very loyal fandom that listens to absolutely everything he says. And they take it as gospel. And regardless of what happens, and I've spoken about this before, for example, the tariffs. So what he's doing in relation to China is actually simply following Biden's recommended policy. When I say Biden's, I mean Biden's Biden cabinets.
Yeah, the Biden regime, the Biden era,
Yeah. So what he's doing in relation to China. So if you read the document that is still, I'm not sure where. That's the American embassy. That's an American embassy document in China. And back during Biden's presidency, that was 2023 or 2024, if I'm not mistaken. There's a recommendation for the next administration. What should we do? And everything Trump does currently, you can find in that document. So the recommendation is, if you don't want to read the whole thing, it's actually it's on the third or second page. We recommend to maintain the tariff pressure or potentially increase it. So every time there's a grandiose statement, you scratch it just a bit and you realize that not much has changed at all. And the train keeps going. Now, back to his foreign policy. Now, there's this dichotomy, let's call it, in the United States between, let's call them Democrats and let's call them Republicans, as much as meaningless as I think those terms are, but let's call them that. So one group of people has been propagandized to hate Palestine and Iran and China. These are the Republican. And the other side of the meaningless political spectrum that it is.
The political spectrum of the two sides of the same coin, yes.
Exactly. So the other side has been convinced that Russia is the enemy. So they kind of keep going back and forth between the two. And again, I'll come back to the cycle of aggression that I talk about in that article. It keeps going back and forth. So now we have Donald Trump back in office. And now, well, we don't want Russians to be our enemies. Marco Rubio, just like Hillary Clinton back in the day, talks to Russia and talks about Russia. There's no reason to be enemies, etc., etc. But now that the Republicans are in power, well, China is the enemy now, you see, because China is bad. I mean, that's natural. We have to have an enemy, right? So now China is bad. So it keeps just changing from one orientation to the other. And this is what I keep saying, that when I say, as far as foreign policy, United States foreign policy is concerned, there is never any change, simply a reorientation. And we can see it again with this old, new, old administration. It is reorienting. Just this past week, the United States missed the meeting on Ukraine security, right? Because they no longer care, because they reoriented themselves towards Iran. I mean, for the past, 3 weeks it is now, they're collecting military assets for a possible altercation with Iran.
Oh boy, that's that might go really bad for them, the United States side. It's kind of one of those things where it's like, but it's the same thing about this whole like seeing them as barbarians, because I don't think that they understand that, like, you know, the Iranians have really developed a lot of sort of cheap drone effective weapons, and the Iranians really have only one real threat. And they've really analyzed that threat over the last, 40, 50 years-ish. I don't think it's going to go too well. If they really try to park some big ships outside of Iran and try to launch some kind of invasion or just fire rockets from there, I think those ships might be in real deep doo-doo. Even as of, it was something like 10, 15 years ago, I read an article that even back then, it was written by a military expert who broke down how the U.S. Navy is not designed to fight the Iranians, but the Iranians are designed to fight the U.S. Navy. It's going to be ugly, man. I hope they don't do it. But anyways.
So do I. For the sake of everyone.
Yeah, for the sake of the lives of those guys, I would be very happy if they did.
And Iranians, of course, as well.
Because them too.
The United States Army doesn't stand on ceremony, does it? We've seen that time and time again. Yeah. I now want to... Okay, so we've discussed that the Trump administration, or my thesis, is that it really is no different, again, in the small issues that, and I'm sure people are going to listen to this, and when I say small issues, they're going to ask, what do you mean small issues? They're not small issues, they're important for me, which is fair enough, but they're not the important issues, again, on the grand scale.
Yeah, for the future of the United States as a civilization, even if you don't like the term. But yes.
Right. Okay. I am absolutely loving that you said that. The future of the United States. And this is where I actually wanted to talk to you a bit about, I said in the beginning of the stream that Russia and Russians have a bit of an identity crisis. And when it comes to Americans as a nation, let's call it that, as a nation, I think also has a bit of an identity crisis, but in a different way, in a way that, and I'm sorry if I'm being a bit unjust, unfair to Americans.
No, man. Hey, you can criticize the United States as harsh as you want here, but I have the right to defend the United States too on this program as a U.S. citizen. So go nuts. But I'll defend it.
So again, hopefully I'm not being unjust. The United States as a nation, so as a state, as a collective of people in that specific geographical location, state, has a tendency for fiscal thinking. And what I mean by that is, what do we want out of this in the next year? Or in 2 years? Or in 4 years, right? Because that's the presidential term. We now have Trump. So he has 4 years to do the things that he said he wants to do. And I phrase it like that for a very specific
Well,
reason.
yeah.
Um, if any change in the grand scheme of things is to come, and I'm sure there are plenty of people on both sides of the political spectrum who want to justify to themselves internally the current situation, the current, again, cycles of aggression against the various countries, be it Russia, be it Iran, be it China. I'm sure there's always a way to internally justify that by saying these guys are terrorists, these guys are invaded unprovoked, etc., etc., or these guys oppress this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's always a way to justify it. But at the end of the day, I don't think the vast majority of Americans, and correct me if I'm wrong,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think the vast majority of Americans wants endless war. Am I?
In theory, they don't, because every time there seems to be an alternative candidate who's like, no, let's leave this war or let's not start a war, they always seem to get the favor. So if you look at the voting patterns of the average American, Americans in general vote for peace. They just don't get it.
Yeah. Funnily enough, Trump took very little amount of time to commit more war crimes in Yemen the other day,
Mm-hmm.
when he bombed a religious gathering.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
Oh, big mistake.
and of
Yeah,
course,
that was I'll put it this way. Although I still say I like Trump in a lot of ways. After that day, I liked him less.
yeah. But so these are the grand scheme of things that I keep talking about. These are the ways that the United States keeps going in the same directions,
Yeah, yeah.
regardless of who the president is. So back to the fiscal thinking. So the way I see it, Americans as peoples, as a nation, really needs to ask themselves, what do we want to be, not in 4 years, meaning,
Hmm.
well, in 4 years, we want Trump to cancel transgender bathrooms or be friends with Russia or whatever the case may be. But what do we want to be in 50 years? What do we want to be in 100 years? And start making decisions, political decisions. And by the way, when I say people, I don't just mean the voters, I also mean the politicians, because they're one people. Okay. I
Hmm.
don't make the distinction between, I know most people do, and I'm sure many people will disagree with me on that. I don't make that distinction. The politicians in power, or the statesmen, maybe let's call it that, in power, they are people, right? They didn't materialize out of oblivion and became
Oh yeah.
president and ministers. They were born in that country, raised in that country, so they're part of that country. So I don't make that distinction. So all of these people need to start thinking what they want to be and start making decisions based on that. Now, regardless of what that is, if you want to continue being, let's stay professional, global policeman, if you
Hmm.
want to continue to be that, then just do that. If you
No.
want to actually become a country that,
Well, and again, about the whole global policeman thing, is that that is a definite thing where the sort of Washington has never agreed with the masses, because in theory, if you were to sort of like do some sort of generic breakdown of like how do Americans see the world, the whole concept of being the global policeman is just antithetical to this society that was supposed to be founded on being essentially protected by two oceans and far away from the constant wars of Europe and all this stuff. So yeah, it's kind of like in a lot of ways. I think again, it's our the thing that kills America. It's the thing that made it, and the thing that's killing us is our individualism. Because in a lot of ways, I think being more individualistic gave us a lot of interesting advantages, and especially the 19th century. But now our individualism means we're completely compartmentalized and thus completely helpless to change anything or do anything. We are atomized to the limit.
yeah, okay, that's an interesting point. We can come back
Yeah.
to that. Let me just finish what I wanted to say.
Sure
So
thing.
you said it. You said an interesting thing that people are anti-war and vote for the anti-war candidate, but every time that happens, and Trump is an anti-war candidate, isn't he? I mean,
Yes.
which was funny because when you recall what he did during his first presidency, it was no different to Obama or
Well,
Biden.
I can say one
So
thing that this is too is remember about Trump though. This was pointed out by a Russian journalist, and I cannot remember which one. So unfortunately, this first part is he mentioned on TV is like, well, remember what Trump said about North Korea? I will bring fire and death to them, and then he just met with Kim Jong Un and worked out a deal. I'm going to take that to the next level, where if you remember when he bombed Syria and they shot 72 rockets into Syria, the overwhelming majority of which were shot down, and the others probably killed someone or perhaps farm animals. Who knows? And then he did nothing. If you recall, Fareed Zakaria on CNN said, finally, Donald Trump is an American president after he launched this meaningless, futile attack. And in some ways, I want to say I'm not trying to, what is that called when people just condone anything the person they like does. Oh, I'm not going to butt kiss Trump, but with the Houthis and Yemen, I think this is part of Trump's way of sort of providing the spectacle that he needs for, let's just say, the people who like war. Okay, just launch, just launch at something, whatever, who cares? Would you say that there's any validity to that?
Again, I'll first finish what I wanted to say,
Okay,
and
you do
I'll
that. All right.
come back to the validity of what you just said. If I forget, please remind me.
Sure.
So what I wanted to say, the interesting thing that I saw in 2020 and I saw in 2016 and I see it today. So Trump ran on the anti-war. Well, I'm the peaceful candidate. I'll stop all the wars, which of course anyone who knows anything about US foreign policy knew that this is not going to happen. But people were really excited about this. And when I say people, especially his, as I called it before, fandom. So when you go to, for example, a conservative, I do this because, again, all these terms, when you go to a conservative website, news website, a news outlet, you see it in the comments. If you go to a conservative MAGA, Pepe, all that stuff, Telegram channel, you see it as well. And what you see is, before he was elected, people were saying, well, Trump is this amazing, peaceful guy, and everyone was applauding it. And when you look at the emojis under the posts, it's all clapping and hearts and words of support for that. Yet, when you go to a channel like that today, to look at a video of a religious gathering being massacred by American bombs, you see the same reactions. You see heart emojis and you see clapping. So which one is it?
Yeah.
And this is what I mean by identity crisis. Again, although in a different way from Russia, but it's there because, well, what do you want then? Because you've reacted positively to him saying he will stop all the wars, yet here he is committing war crimes, and you're still celebrating it. So which one is it? You can't have it both ways. Now we can have a very long conversation about the MAGA
mindset. The MAGA mindset. No. Pavel, you all right?
the conflicting. Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to find the best way to call it. Dissonance. There you go.
Dissonance. Oh, okay.
We could spend a very long time talking about the dissonance in video game terms, ludonarrative dissonance. Yeah. So one thing is being told as a narrative, and then another thing is actually happening, and you're trying to connect the two into in the context of the real world. And so we can spend a very long time talking about that, but I get that's not what today's stream is about. So back to the original one. People need to understand what they want. And if they want long-term change, so now is maybe a good time for me to go over the LGBT stuff. So if this is important to you, now I aspire to be an Orthodox Christian. It's important to me. However, back to the grand scheme of things, et cetera, et cetera. But if you want all that gone, do you really think that 4 years is enough for that? Because it wasn't born yesterday.
No.
These extremes weren't born yesterday, and they weren't born in this decade.
Yeah.
They were evolving since the early 60s.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you expect Trump to change course long term? Not that he, while he's the admin, I'm calling it, while he's the president, he will change all that and then everything will revert back. How do you expect them to change something in 4 years that has been in the making for 65?
Yeah. Well, the
You can't
counter
do that.
argument to that would be that that's why J.D. Vance was picked to be his successor, someone who could easily win a presidential race and is competent and more or less agrees with Trump and so on and so forth. So it's sort of because very often, as you know, Pavel, the vice president of the United States is kind of just a clown. They're not really super important, whereas Vance is really being groomed. So you would have more 65 years versus, in theory, Trump is sort of offering 12. But still, it's not. It's the flaw of the two-party system, one of the many, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Well, I'll go as far as to say that it's a flaw of a representative democratic republic.
Well, if you, for some of our long-term viewers would know, I actually have quite the long list of, let's just say, complaints about Western-style democracy as a whole. Don't worry, they extend to other political systems as well, but the idea that hundreds of people in a room, none of whom are generally the expert on the thing being voted on, somehow will magically vote on things and make them happen in a super effective way is BS. It doesn't work. It's a bad idea, and it also probably the only reason that there are parliaments and senates and congresses and all that, it's because the Romans did it. That's literally the only reason that we have the system is because, well, the Romans had it. So that meant that the British had to have it, and then from the British, everyone else had to have it. And like in Russia, they have a upper and lower house of the Duma's the lower house. Well, anyways, basically like Congress, they had an upper and lower house. Why? Because in England they had the Lords and Commons. It's it's all very trivial and meaningless. It is not a good system.
Exactly, it is meaningless, and we can go. You mentioned Rome. We can also go back to ancient Athens, which everyone always gives you as an example of something to strive towards. However, if you actually looked at how democracy worked in Athens, you would realize that that's not what you imagine it to be.
No.
But what you said, so I'll come to JD Vance in a second, but you said an interesting thing that we do it because Romans did it, and so the idea of these people making correct decisions. Now, I would go further and say the idea of these people making any decisions, correct or incorrect, because, and I say this because of the nature of power, which always concentrates. It doesn't matter what you do. If you give it enough time, it concentrates, either with a single individual, and then you have dictatorships or monarchies or whatever you want to call it, or with a group of people, which you then can call whatever you want. If you want to be pretentious about it, you can call it a representative democracy, whatever. But so that's just a quick note. So back to JD Vance. It's actually funny that we mentioned democracy, because you put it, you said it in an interesting way. JD Vance is being groomed.
Yeah.
Is that the way you put it, right?
Yeah,
He's being groomed.
Yes.
Yeah, so prepared. Let's say prepared. Groomed maybe carries a negative connotation. So let's say prepared to be the next president, which is great if that's the case. But if that's the case, are we really still talking about a republic if someone is being prepared? Because, I mean, no one is being prepared for no reason, just on the off chance that he becomes the next president, right? So someone must be there thinking, okay, this guy has a very good chance, let's prepare him for that.
Yeah.
Which then raises the question, at least in my head, for me, it raises the question, why are they so sure that they're willing to spend all this time, effort, and money into preparing him? So again, back to the original, maybe even rhetorical question. Are we still actually talking about a republic, or are we talking about something else? And this is actually another thing that I wanted to talk to you about. When I said Americans need to decide what they want and then act accordingly, do you actually still want to be a republic? When I say you, I mean Americans. Because as far as I can tell, many people on the MAGA right, let's call it that, again, all these terms, but just
Yeah,
for the
yeah.
sake of the conversation, all these people on the MAGA right, is that really what you want? Because now that Trump is talking about his third term, etc., would you not rather have someone that you really like Donald Trump or someone else? It can be
They
Bernie
want to
Sanders
have
for
their
all
own
I
Putin. Their own Putin. Oh, who said that? Was that ghosts? I don't know.
So this is the idea of Caesarism. So in
Yeah.
in political science, the term Caesarism, of course, talks about the post-republic period.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So do you maybe this is I'm not suggesting anything. I'm not American. I don't really care that much, but maybe it's worth considering. Maybe the period of, let's say, pretense republic and an oligarchy in factuality, maybe that period needs to end, and maybe the country needs to actually transform into something else based on the things that you want. And this is the question, again, when I say you Americans, based on the things that you want. And this is why it's so important to understand what is it actually that we want. If we want to maintain our delusions of a republic, nothing will ever change, because I mean, unless
Well,
an
yeah, dude, to be honest,
exceptional,
because you're asking what people want, and I think that what people want is very contradictory. People want this idea of this fancy word called democracy and all this other cutesy poo stuff, but then somehow have basically they want to somehow have this system that has proven to not really be working in the interest of the average person somehow
yeah,
can be the same, but then start working in the interests of the average person, and it's like, no, you know,
yeah,
yeah, I think there could be a sort of false concept of how things worked in the past. I think a lot of people think that the system that we have at some point in time was perfect, and like in the 50s,
yeah,
we were rich because the system really worked back then. Our free market capitalism with democracy really worked the best in the 50s. It had nothing to do with the whole, World War II. All of our competition murdered itself while we built ourselves up. No, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the system working, you know. So I think I think that
no,
the
of course not,
people,
of course.
the average person, whether in Russia or America or China or India, it doesn't matter, is really, I think, actually incapable of quite understanding or putting into words or proper planning what they want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely, and that goes that applies to all levels, from your average Joe to all the way to the president.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
seems to be some kind of uh, bipolarity, in a sense, that, well, as you said, well, we want this, but we also want that.
Well,
Well, if it's mutually exclusive, then you need to pick one.
well, yeah, well, dude,
Because
human beings are rational because, dude, especially talk to the MAGA crowd about freedom. We've got to be libertarian and freedom and only get involved in voluntary agreements and this and that. But when it comes to someone else's dog pooped on their lawn, they call the police.
yeah,
We have to understand that another thing we don't tell people is that all human beings live in some sort of society. There's no, at least as of present, there's no sort of like weird desert zone. Maybe, I don't know, in the Sahara Desert, I guess in the middle of it, there's probably not many rules. But overall, most of us live in a society and we voluntarily repress ourselves via the police in order to live in a better way. We choose to be repressed. We are the modern day peasantry. And human beings don't like that. They like the idea of, you know what? I voted for the president. I'm his boss. Dude, go. Oh, sorry. I should. Not you. That kind of person needs to go f themselves. But
I've
that's
had
what they
so many of
think.
these conversations with people, actually. So I'm not a big fan of this idea of democracy, because it's demonstrably not the case. Can we just skip the pretense? But
Well, yeah.
anyway, you say there's many people, a large portion of people, who not only think that all of that is real, but it's also worth fighting for. So this is how the European Union especially
Yeah.
uses it. You see it about in every statement about Ukraine and Russia. It's freedom and democracy, and let's be free. But what I wanted to say about that is that you then have conversations with people and you ask them, what do you actually like? Why do you care about the form of government in your country? What do you care? It doesn't make any difference to you in practice. Extremes.
Well, again,
Extremes.
that's we really pump people's heads full of this idea where a lot of this stuff really matters, and I would say it's sort of it can. I mean, if you were to go, I just was watching a video where they showed some clips. It was a Russian video, so they showed some realistic clips about life in Cuba, right? And you know, it has the flavor of a communist system, waiting in line to buy stuff forever, this, that, and the other. But there are some differences. But people are sort of fed this idea that if you live in like this kind of communist country, your life is a complete nightmare versus the beautiful glory of democracy. And I wouldn't say that. People there, they still eat enough to survive. It's just that they have a goofier system, there's this idea that like any alternative system is always just going to be evil, and it's not the case. It might just be really annoying.
That's complete nonsense. You brought the example. You gave me the example of Cuba.
Yeah.
If you remember, maybe you remember, about 2 years ago, a video from North Korea appeared of people enjoying themselves in a water park. Have you seen that video?
No, but I do know they built water. Mr. Un has done a very good job of developing Korea because, 10, 15 years ago when YouTube was young, they would always say, the Kims, because this was before he took power, Kim Il-sung, basically, he only would do stuff for his inner party members. The only people in North Korea that benefit are the inner elite. And now the thing is, they only care about Pyongyang. Pyongyang is the shining pearl in like a pile of feces of a country. And I was like, wait a minute. So before he took power, only the elite got the benefit. Now there's only one magical city of over 1 million people. Maybe their country's just developing. I don't know. But anyways.
So this video came out of people enjoying themselves in a water park.
Yeah.
And people commented under that video being in absolute shock that North Korea has water parks.
Well,
why would you be surprised about that? There are people just like
because
you.
It's a totalitarian regime where people have to fight in gladiator pits. Or remember, dude, wasn't there a news story just a couple years ago that like Kim Jong-un fed his uncle to an alligator as like a punishment? Or something. You're like, dude, that's the stuff that you get told about this. Or there's always shaky cam footage from North Korea. Look at the shaky cam. Look, people are starving to death. Well, true, there's a lot of people who aren't fat in North Korea, but you're like, is that person really starving? No, shaky cam, they're starving. Like, oh okay, whatever.
No, so when talking about examples like that, so Cuba, North Korea, if you again actually look at the history of the country, when it comes to North Korea, you very quickly realize that the economic situation that they find themselves in largely traces back to the fact that they've been bombed to oblivion by the United States, and also with all the sanctions. Look, this is obviously nonsense when it comes to. But anyway, so the original point, I actually wrote South Park instead of South Korea. You can tell what I'm thinking about.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, all these ideas about we started with the idea of normalizing relations. We went through the fact that it's not possible because people consider Russia to be this and consider themselves to be something else. The examples that you just gave of Cuba and that I gave of North Korea, those are the same examples. So there's the first civilized world, and then there are the rest of them, the barbarians. And maybe we can go, well, somewhere in the middle we have the satellite states, right? The European Union.
Mm-hmm.
So I am looking for something else. However, now we really need to. It was your wish. We really need to find something to disagree about. So let's talk about something else.
Well, then it would be getting back to Trump's policies. Okay, so how is Trump's big tariff mania? How is that different from other presidents? Because some people would say that Trump seems to be trying to break the American economy away from globalism to restore some sort of industrial base, essentially to, whether he would know it or not, enter the multipolar world.
Right. So when it comes to, I always try to be careful when I say what are people actually genuinely trying to do, right? So when you can ask the question, is Trump doing this or that because he genuinely wants to do that, or is that something he says but in actuality that's not actually what's happening? So I don't know. I don't talk to Trump, and we can only really tell after some time passes to see what actually transpired. Now, when it comes to tariffs, I've already spoken about the fact that these tariffs were, well, against China specifically, that they were recommended by the previous administration. Now, when it comes to a lot of the stuff that he says about other countries,
Yeah.
like Canada, for example, and you and we discussed this before, again, very briefly, and I gave you an example of deals or agreements being made with Canada that go back to the 80s, and then they were renewed actually in, if I remember correctly, 2017 or 18, whatever the case may be. So there was a standing agreement with Canada on tariffs. And then Trump, because Trump likes to talk a lot and likes to make big statements, he said that deal is not fair and we're getting screwed and we need to change all that. So what happened is someone took that agreement, which goes back to the 80s. Don't quote me on the 80s, maybe, but I have a sneaking suspicion that it was the 80s. Let's take that. Let's very slightly rephrase that. Let Trump sign it, and nothing really changes. And that's exactly what happened during his first term, specifically with Canada. I'm talking specifically about Canada now. The agreement was slightly rephrased. In effect, it was the same agreement, but Trump could then go out there and say to his fandom, look, I made a wonderful new agreement. Am I not great? I am great. And I have great people working for me. Yeah. And so this, when it comes to him, these constant exaggerations, just gross exaggerations of everything he does and says, it's still there, just like it was in 2016. So that's Canada. When it comes to the UK, right, the United Kingdom is another country that was, quote unquote, surprised about Trump's, as he calls it, reciprocal tariffs. Well, the United Kingdom, so back to his fandom. As they always do, they believe everything Trump says, and they think that the United Kingdom is screwing over the United States and is really unfair. Well, if you actually, because, I mean, people can do all this themselves. They don't need me or you to tell them. You can do this all yourself. You can go to the documents of the Bank of England. You can go back to the documents of, back then it was Liz. It was her, I think.
Liz Truss? I think it was. She wasn't there for long, but yeah.
Yeah, no, but I think it happened. There's document after document after document expressing the willingness to remove the existing tariffs, not expand tariffs, lower the tariffs that for one reason or another must be there. And yet again, here we have Trump presenting it as the United States is getting screwed over. And then he gives people these numbers, right? So on one side, we've seen this, what was it, 2-3 days ago, when he gave a list of countries. This is how much they charge us, but we are really kind, so we will only reciprocate with half that amount, right? Because we are kind. And he shows these numbers. But this is 5% of the story. These percentages,
also doesn't make sense because tariffs are almost always set to like these different things have different tariff rates, and some things have none, and some things have some. So I don't understand. I just myself was kind of like, what is like a reciprocal tariff? So it would have to be very specific. It would have to be like gold exports from Russia, grain exports, I don't know, this type, buckwheat exports. They'd have to be completely specific to each individual item.
Exactly. Perfectly put. he shows a table, 10%, 10% on what?
Yeah.
Or of what? When? So, and same thing with the tariffs that he's showing from other countries, right? So this country tariffs us at, I don't know, whatever, 40% rate. Again, on what? When? Etc. etc. And
Yeah.
so these numbers, as I said, 5% of the story, but people take them at face value and think that all American production is being tariffed and we don't tariff them. Why not? And maybe Trump is correct. Maybe we should tariff them. However, what this does at the end of the day, now, okay, let me begin with what most people think that Trump wants to do. Trump wants to destabilize the markets in the short term. So in the long term, the industry comes back to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
For better, whatever. So that's what he wants to do. That's what most people who I assume know a lot about it. I'm not an economist, but people that I assume, again, know more about it than I do, or I hope, that's what they think he wants to do. That's great. Now, I can't think of a single time in history when tariff wars ended well for anyone, because what they do, so that initial destabilization of the markets, and you could see this in the past couple of days, you can see the stock market plummeting. So these,
Yeah. In fact, speaking of how you like to mention how memes change, it was very much during the Biden era that people would use, that thing where it shows all the different squares where the red or
oh
green
yeah, I saw
reflect
that.
the stock market.
Yeah.
There were so many memes where Biden and is just in a sea of red squares, and now Trump is on a mountain of red squares, but he sits on top of them like an emperor. So it's good now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it's good because there's. When you talk about memes, I've seen a meme the other day, which was Joe Biden. I think it was Joe Biden and the German, Austrian, whatever guy, Klaus Schwab, was he?
The fourth industrial
And
revolution
Soros,
guy.
the eat bugs guy.
Yeah, that guy. Yeah, Klaus. I
Yeah,
always want
Klaus.
to call him
So it was
Charles because there's a famous investor in America named Charles Schwab. But anyways, he's Klaus. Yeah.
Klaus. Yeah. So it was Joe Biden, Klaus, and Soros that everyone dislikes.
Oh yeah.
So it was that, and they said something along the lines of AI chips in the head and this and this. So really bad things that everyone hates.
Yeah, but
And
Elon
then
Musk loves AI chips.
yeah. And then underneath that, you have Trump and Musk saying the same thing, and people going, "Whoa, that's
Yeah.
amazing." So we can throw that into the basket of the things that that don't make a difference when it comes to who's the president, right? So the agenda continues, but now another person says it. So, and this is where we can come back to the again fandom / cult of personality, because it doesn't matter what he says, it's good because Trump says it, and this is a huge problem for any country, because do you really? I mean, you're supposed to care about the policies, not about the person, right? I mean,
Oh, you should, but that's not human nature. That's like if you remember the Dune books by Frank Herbert. The entire point of the books was that he wrote in interviews that he gave because he lived I think he died somewhere in the mid '80s. He expressed the idea that you shouldn't be too trustful of great leaders and stuff. I'm like that was the whole point of these books, and I was always kind of thinking, you know what? That's really contradictory to human nature. If you go back to the Bible, why was the Pharaoh the bad guy versus the Jews? Not just because he was on the other side, but because he declared himself to be a living God. And that is, I think, that some people want out of their leaders. And we are going to be an eternal fight against our own selves to not do that. But it is very hard, because people want to be ruled by a living god, Pharaoh, or a worm god, as in the Dune books.
yeah, I don't think I can disagree with that. However, there must be a cutoff point, right? Where if it becomes so painfully obvious, maybe the first step would be to not agree with things you've previously disagreed with passion just because someone else says it.
Yeah.
Maybe that can be the first step. But I now forgot what the overall point of what I was saying was. I lost my train of thought.
No, I kind of
Tim.
knocked you off there. Sorry, I just love to bring up the Dune books because it is the exact, like, perfect sort of Western argument against an authoritative figure with power, and yet the books literally prove the opposite to be true because the God Emperor creates this plan called the Golden Path, which saves humanity. So, and that Golden Path involved some sort of levels of tyranny we've never even dreamt of in real human history, but it worked. So that's another thing. You're reading this as a teenager, you're like, wait, but I thought that the plan was evil, but it worked. Oh well. Well, anyways, very the enlightening how that author could create such an amazing series of works to prove one point, and yet he proved the exact opposite. But anyways, Pavel, I think I've taken up a lot of your time tonight. I think we've gone into a lot of really interesting discussions. I hope you'll come back on the program. I had a great time today. I thought we might get more argumentative. Maybe during the daytime I'm more cranky.
Before we go.
But yes.
Before we go.
Oh, please do. Oh, please. Okay.
Before we go, let's very briefly talk about draining swamps.
Oh.
Because that's
yeah.
Everyone's favorite pastime is draining swamps. So, was the swamp drained in 2016? Well, between 2016 and 2020.
No.
I would argue that the swamp is deeper than it ever was. Well, up to 2020. Is the swamp being drained now that the United States has, well, it always did, but a very prevalent oligarch in a position of government funding? I mean, is the swamp really being drained, or is it expanding just like it did 5 years ago? And so this is really, I think if anything,
yeah,
that I would love people to take away from this conversation is to ask, whenever they hear Trump or anyone else, it doesn't matter who it is, whenever they hear a statement, to ask themselves, is this really the case? And follow that question. So we're draining the swamp. Is this really the case? We're canceling or disbanding or whatever US aid. Is this really the case? By the way, I also wanted to discuss all the court proceedings, but maybe let's do that next time.
Yeah.
But so always, this is an extremely important question. Is this really the case? What I'm hearing, does my brain need to perform mental gymnastics in order to explain something? Or is it actually what is being said? Very important question. So if there's one thing I'd like people to take away, please take away this. And yeah, Tim, I'll definitely. It took us a while to get together.
Oh yeah, but that was I think more my fault than anything. I'd like to apologize for that. Man, 2025 has been real hard work wise, man. I've had to work a lot. I don't know how I'm going to make it to 2026. That's tough times.
Right.
Yeah.
A lot of excitement. No. Well, Tim, thank you very much for having me on tonight. It was a pleasure. I can say the same thing. I would love to come back. And yeah, I hopefully your audience enjoyed the conversation. And yeah.
And so Pavel Krasnov, Czech Russian journalist and political analyst. Is there anything you're trying to promote, a way that people can find you or something, or do you not have much social media presence?
Here's what I would love to promote.
Yes.
Don't look for objective news. Look at news objectively.
Oh, okay. There you go. That's a good plug for me. Anyways, friends, Tim Kirby Russia signing out.